Afghanistan, you would have, Qaeda would have us just get out.
Right.
Then al-Qaeda would come back and launch another attack.
Well, first of all, we know that al-Qaeda is not in Afghanistan. They're in Pakistan.
All right,
a lot of other places. They're in Yemen.
The Taliban would take over. Women would be enslaved.
Right.
They'd attack us again.
I think we have to remember why we went into Afghanistan after 9/11. As I said, I supported that intervention, as did my colleagues. But the mission has changed very dramatically since then. We are not just hunting al-Qaeda. We are trying to build a functioning nation state in Afghanistan, which is a fool's errand. Nation building is always a fool's errand, and it's not essential to U.S. national security. We can hunt al-Qaeda and degrade their ability to carry out a future attack, and also ultimately, I think, discourage other countries, other leaders like the Taliban, from making common cause with them. I would argue we had done that in the first few months of the intervention in Afghanistan, and that mission has just allowed to creep and grow.
What you're saying is don't shortchange the troops,
right,
but cut the mission.
Right.
What do you mean?
We have to rethink the purpose of our military. Start from scratch. Start from the core function, which is to defend the United States, and expect and demand for other countries to play the primary role of defending themselves and to police their respective regions. If we were to do that, if we were to rethink that central mission and say the United States military is not the first responder for every 911 call in the world, then I think we could responsibly reduce military spending quite dramatically, actually. If you bring them back from places like Europe where they're simply not needed any longer, if you say
50,000 soldiers in Germany.
Right. Defending them from what exactly? It's not entirely clear to me.
And I'm struck by something you wrote about how the spending is on autopilot. That
yes.
Every year they give the Army, the Navy, the Air Force the same amount?
Right.
They don't even make a decision?
Right. There's a lot of inertia in government spending, and especially in military spending. What you spend is what you spent last year plus a little bit more. But in terms of the base budget, the services basically get the same shares, and that goes back decades, actually.
The last change was Eisenhower, who was a general, and maybe he had the confidence because of that, who said, I'm going to give more to the Air Force, less to the Army, because I'm worried about Russia and nuclear war.
Right. Especially coming out of the Korean War, Eisenhower said, we're not going to do that again. I'm not going to launch another land war in Asia. He was criticized by that. People like John Kennedy and other liberal Democrats said, you're giving up, you're ceding the field to the Soviets. I think ultimately Eisenhower's judgment was correct.
Well, thank you, Chris Preble. Your writings have opened my mind. I encourage you to check them out at the Cato Institute. If I had my way, we'd abolish the Department of Energy. But I don't have my way, and I'll show you why that's a bad thing next.
How can you have all these duplicate programs? Why should I pay for them? Why do we need you people?
That was me yelling at the Department of Energy. The GAO report complains about their redundant programs, but I say, why doesn't an energy department exist at all? They don't produce energy. We don't need them. Save $18 billion, abolish the whole department. But it's not going to happen, so let's focus on just one piece of the GAO report, the billions in subsidies for ethanol. Now, Republicans, I'm told, are against subsidies. They don't like Obama's green handouts. They say subsidies distort the economy. And they do. So it's nice that Republicans are against subsidies. Oh, except when those subsidies go to their friends who make ethanol.
This is what we make ethanol out of.
They claim it saves energy and burns cleaner. But now we know that's not true. Cornell scientists found making ethanol uses more energy than it creates. And a new Stanford study finds ethanol releases more pollutants like ozone. But we still spend billions subsidizing ethanol because influential politicians claimed.
It burns cleaner and it creates less emissions.
Except that it doesn't. Today, former Governor Bush emailed me to say he still thinks that it burns cleaner, but he doesn't believe it should get government support. So that's good, at least. But many Republicans do still want to subsidize ethanol, and Democrats want to subsidize ethanol, plus wind, solar, geothermal, electric cars, everything. So it all gets subsidized. Who says bipartisanship is dead? Fortunately, I'm not alone in my yelling at the Energy Department. Michael Needham is yelling with me. He's head of Heritage Action, which is the action arm of the Heritage Foundation. So what's action mean?
You know, the Heritage Foundation has 700,000 members, and we feel like we've won the battle of ideas. We know that energy policy doesn't make sense. The Department of Energy is picking winners and losers, as you said, at the tune of $18.6 billion per year. We decided winning the war of ideas isn't enough, and so we created Heritage Action. We have a website, heritageaction.com, where people can go to hold Congress accountable and stop this just out-of-control energy policy.
And lobby and fight, because Heritage would lose its tax deduction if it got involved in a political fight.
Absolutely.
All right, so you're doing that, and you got more than 30 groups to write a letter to Congress asking for 4 things, which are?
You know, the Department of Energy right now basically picks winners and losers. They spend $18.6 billion per year saying we're going to favor ethanol, as you said, we're going to favor wind and solar, which get 20 times the types of credits that other forms of energy get. And we said we should have a level playing field. Everybody should be able to compete. We shouldn't say that bureaucrats in Washington inside that building that you were yelling in front of get to choose who wins or loses. The market should choose. And so what we say is no more new credits.
And it's just a way that I like to think about that. People say, well, we need government to set an energy policy. But the free market is an energy policy. If it's a good idea, people will invest in it.
That's exactly right. Ronald Reagan explained our country's energy policy when he summarized how government thinks. And it's if it moves, tax it. If it keeps moving, regulate it. And if it stops moving, subsidize it. And what we do is we spend billions and billions of dollars subsidizing non-viable forms of energy at the expense of forms of energy that have been proven to work.
But you don't want to subsidize. What's proven to work is oil and coal, and they get some subsidies. I assume you want to get rid of those too.
Level playing field. Let's go into the tax code. Let's have a flat tax. Let's make sure that everybody's competing on the same exact level, and let's let the market choose what works. Let's not have some bureaucrat in Washington saying that because my ideology tells me that clean tech is what we should have, that's what we're going to subsidize.
And let's put up this chart we have of the current energy subsidies. This compares it per unit of energy produced. Coal gets subsidies, yes, natural gas and oil, they're at the top, and you can't even see the yellow part of the bar graph on them because their subsidies are so small compared to solar, which is awful, and I guess wind is about that same level, and ethanol, the most of all. And yet the Republicans want to keep doing this.
Well, this is all about politics, and it's largely about presidential politics in Iowa. We don't need bureaucrats saying that we need new technologies. We have a venture capital industry. We have a private sector that makes these investors. Instead, you have know-it-alls in Washington who say we can make choices. It's the wrong way to go as a country. It's not a real energy policy.
So does Heritage, which people think of as a Republican group, do they give the Republicans a hard time about this, hold their feet to the fire? I see agribusiness gives more to Republicans than Democrats.
Yeah, you know, we're a nonpartisan organization. We don't think it makes sense for Republicans to be rent-seeking. We don't think it makes sense for Democrats.
And rent-seeking, explain that?
So if you look at the lobbying industry, for example, we talked about clean tech earlier.
But just to back it up, rent-seeking is a phrase economists use to say sucking up to government to get stuff.
That's exactly right. You have lobbyists in Washington who say it's easier for me as a business model to spend $1 million lobbying Congress to get them to give me a $30 million or a $1 billion handout rather than actually going and investing in a business plan. You have all sorts of lobbying going on in Washington. 10 years ago, the clean tech industry, solar, wind, those types of industries, spent $2.6 million lobbying Congress. In the last 10 years, as the Department of Energy grew, as more money was handed out through Washington, that's risen to $30 million. The number of lobbying organizations has gone from 20 to 200. We have a system right now in this country where Washington is picking winners and losers, not the market. That makes absolutely no sense.
So I didn't seem to be making any progress yelling with my bullhorn at the Energy Department. You live in Washington. Are the congressmen hearing you?
I think so. For the first time, we actually have cuts going on in Washington. It's pretty amazing what's going on in Washington, where you're actually going through and the House of Representatives is passing large cuts.
So far, by the way, ethanol subsidies have survived the Republicans' budget cut proposals.
That's exactly right. We had an opportunity last December actually to end the ethanol production credit. Unfortunately, that Congress passed it and extended it for one more year. We have another opportunity this year to end that credit, and hopefully the Congress won't do what they did last year. You started off the segment by talking about how out of control our ethanol policy is. It's exactly right. If you go back 2 years ago, we had a mandate that said you have to produce 12.5 billion gallons per year of ethanol. Demand that year was only 8.4 billion gallons. This doesn't make sense, and this is what happens when the bureaucrats in that building that you were yelling it from are the ones making the decisions instead of the market.
And the congressmen are making the decisions, and half of them want to run for president, and their first primary is in Iowa, and apparently to win in Iowa, you have to suck up to these ethanol producers?
That's the system we have, and that's why people have to go out and shine sunshine on what's going on in Congress and then follow what their members of Congress are doing and the votes that they're taking and say, you know what, there's more of us than there are them, and we get to vote every 2 years, every 4 years for president, and we're not going to keep allowing these guys to come to Washington and put the national interest at risk.
The trouble is that the subsidy only costs you and me a few bucks, but if you're in the ethanol business, it's millions, so you fight harder.
It's political science 101. All across the federal government, we have lots of programs that are diffuse that cost us a couple pennies, half a cheeseburger, but matter a lot for the companies that are seeking this, and that's why you have a lobbying industry that's grown to 33,000 lobbyists in Washington, D.C. The only way that we end this is if we all come together and we say we have to put the national interest ahead of the parochial interests of these people who are lobbying Congress for their advantages.
And that cheeseburger costs more because of ethanol subsidies, too.
Costs more because we're putting our corn in our cars instead of raising cows.
Thank you, Michael Needham. And maybe you want to borrow my megaphone and use that. But before I loan this to you, I still need it to shout at another spendthrift, the Education Department. Does the government really need 82 programs to supposedly improve teacher quality? That's next.